Okay, as always, welcome back. And we are still in the course of bioarticulations at the beginning of human life within the program of bioethics here at St. Thomas University. Beginning always with a small prayer, and then with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in us the fire of your divine love. Amen. Okay. As always, I ask any questions or comments about previous lectures or anything that you've seen in the meantime, especially as it relates to the topic. Usually there are bioethical issues coming up on the news, just in secular news at the beginning or the end of life. And it's rare the week that doesn't have a bioethical issue, either on human life or on the bioethics of the environment. And typically when we look at it, it's because of technology, the advancement of technology that continues to move forward. Also because we can understand that technology is associated with the economy, right? Technological advances. Typically startup companies, for example, biotechs, are high risk, but with the possibility of a high return also. And so they are inexorably bound to the possible economic progress of region or a nation. And then once economics is involved in the issue, also politics are going to get involved. And then ideology can also filter into that. So it's complicated. It's complicated. But forever, at least from the Catholic analysis, we go back to nature, because nature was here before technology, and see what we can glean from nature, because nature does tell us, nature educates, but nature is also kind of silent. In other words, we need to observe it and then ponder the process, what's happening, so that we can glean some information and come to some conclusions about nature. All right, so what we're going to talk about today precisely is that confluence between technology and nature with in vitro fertilization, the first part of the lecture. Then the second part will be on natural family planning, all right? So again, feel free to stop me at any point if you have any comment or question as we go along. So also, which is my style, have you seen for any of these particular topics that we cover? First, we try to do the biological or the clinical issues that are involved, and then we do the bioethical analysis built on that, all right? So let's look at IVF first on the biological or medical side of things, what is happening. I don't know if Louise Brown, is the name ring a bell for anybody? Louise Brown. Louise Brown was the first test tube baby, right? She was never really manufactured in the test tube as such. Typically they're Petri dishes, but the test tube perception prevailed, all right? Louise Brown. I don't know, maybe I don't think I've heard the term. Louise Brown was, I believe she was born in 1979. Okay. She was manufactured in 78 and was born in 79. That's a strong word, and manufactured, but you'll see what I mean. She was in Great Britain. She was the first test tube baby. I remember back then, it was 79. You can see I had finished my biology already. I was before I went into the seminary, I was teaching biology at St. Brennan High School. She made the front page of many news media because she was the first test tube baby, right? The first in vitro child to be successful. Doctors Edward and Steptoe. I don't know if those names sound familiar, but years later they went forward to receive the Nobel Prize in medicine for inventing in vitro fertilization.
Okay, so baby M is the first surrogate baby. I just looked it up.
Oh,
From a surrogate mother.
sorry. Oh, okay. We'll talk
Or at least
about.
the one that brought it to legal.
I see.
Prominence.
Okay, we'll talk about surrogate motherhood in the context of NFP. But yeah, it's also a byproduct of in vitro. Anyway, so Louise Brown was born in '79, but the proof of principle, right, had to be held back until when? She was the first successful in vitro child to be born alive. Many attempts were done. Exactly, reproductive success. You know, so they had to wait, and of course, they're not going to force her to have children either or anything like that. But from the strictly biological fact of proving the principle that in vitro fertilization is successful, they had to wait until reproductive success, right? And then, really, if you want to push the principle to 100%, is fertile offspring. So they would have to wait for her children to also be successful in reproduction, all right? Because she could have been infertile, or her children could have been infertile. All right, so anyway, there she is, and that's the proof of principle there. That's her children. But, so she made a lot of news back then. Oh, she was actually born in '78, all right. So the manufacturing then happened in '79. What do I mean by manufacturing? Well, this is what I mean. The natural process of fertilization, I've mentioned, is in the ampulla through the fusion of egg and sperm, up to syngamy and so forth, like we've covered before. But in vitro is done in the lab, and that's why in vitro, actually, for many years now, so in vitro comes from glass, right? In glass, vitro, vidrio en español. Even though it used to be that all the glassware in the lab, all the labware was in fact glass, either Pyrex or Corex, and it would get sterilized, and then, oops. Is that pale? Sorry, yeah. And then these, the glassware would get sterilized, autoclave, and then reused, right? Syringes, Petri dishes, test tubes, you name it. But today, it's all plastic. It comes sterile, packaged, and one-use, single-use plastic, and then disposed. All right, even catheters, you name it. Everything is typically plastic or of some sort. But in vitro kind of stuck, and to this day. At any rate, what happens with in vitro fertilization is that the fertilization itself is done in the lab, all right? So that means physically, physiologically, eggs have to be extracted from the woman, sperm has to be collected from the man, and then mixed, the egg and the sperm, in the lab, typically in Petri dishes. And then the embryo also has to be further manipulated, if you will, because it's not the zygote that implants, right? It's the blastocyst, which takes about 5 days on average to develop for the human. So that little embryo then has to be incubated at body temperature for about 5 days, and then the attempted implantation. So that's in a nutshell the process. We'll go through it in a little more detail to see what all is involved actually physiologically, biologically, mechanically to achieve this. This photo, for example, is an extreme example of in vitro fertilization, a particular type of IVF that is called ICSI, which is intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And it's very descriptive, the word is very descriptive, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. In other words, the sperm is actually injected into the egg, not just put in the Petri dish to fertilize by itself, but literally injected. So you can begin to see the level of sophistication of this industry and the instrumentation that is needed. First of all of this is microscopic and under sterile conditions, right? So, for example, this is an egg with the corona and the zona still attached. In fact, here's a polar body down here. All right, very interesting. These are microphotographs, by the way. These are micrographs, okay? So these are not paintings or drawings. This needle here is injecting, you can barely see it, but there's a sperm here, okay? And there's another one here, so forth. How are these needles made? I remember making these needles when I was doing research at FIU back in the early 70s, because we were injecting chemicals into Aplysia, the sea hare. It's a mollusk that lives locally here in Biscayne Bay. And they have giant neurons, and you can actually inject chemicals in it and generate an action potential on the nerve. Anyway, it's relatively easy to make these needles, and it's kind of fascinating, really, because you just take a glass tube that is hollow, all right, with a Bunsen burner, and you heat up the tube at the hottest part of the flame, which is the tip of the blue inside. The tip of the blue of the flame is the hottest part, and you heat that glass until it's soft. It starts becoming molten, and then you pull fast, all right? And as you pull, eventually it will break. The two glass pieces will come apart. But there's certain characteristics of the tip of that glass. It's not really broken. It gave way molecularly so that there are no fragments or crystals, jagged edges on the tip. That's the first characteristic. It gives you a nice cut surface like that, for example. It could be straight or cut. But the other characteristic is that the very tip, one doesn't see it, but one can feel it. And I remember distinctly, well, I was in my early 20s, way before even thinking about the priesthood, just marine biology, right? I remember looking at this glass with fascination because I could follow with my naked eye, I could follow the glass tube. And then as it started to get narrow toward the tip, all right? But at some point, that tip became invisible, but I could still feel it with my finger. And it was invisible, and it was like touching away from the glass, but no, there was, because it became microscopic. But the most important thing is that even though it became microscopic, it maintained the hole. So you have a tube, a hollow tube, all the way to the very tip, which is now microscopic, therefore it can penetrate a cell, which is also microscopic. So it's very easy to make those probes, all right? That's the easy part, kind of counterintuitive. The hard part is this. So this is another tube, but it's blunt, as you can see here on the edge. This is also glass, and you can see that it has a hole. This is kind of a cross section, has a hole. So what this is the tip of a vacuum. And what it does here, it creates a suction. In fact, you can see on the cellular membrane how it's dipping in a little bit here. All right, so imagine the level of sophistication of this probe to generate a suction there that is sufficient to hold the egg in place, because the egg is very slippery, right? To hold the egg, of course, this is all in nutrient medium that mimics the internal environment of the reproductive system of the woman. To hold that egg in place and neither have too little vacuum to drop it, nor have too much vacuum to suck it in. Imagine the gradation on this instrument, the sophistication of this instrument to hold that steady vacuum there, all right? Enough for the process to be done. So That's the level of instrumentation that there is. In fact, let me skip one here. I should move these slides. So certainly this is done in the lab, and you begin to realize why I am calling this a manufacturing, because it's done with a sophisticated microscope that is an inverted scope, actually. The objectives are underneath the slide, the stage, all right? This little tweezer-like projections, these are micro manipulators connected to a camera that can project on a screen, as you can see here. Here's a probe holding, in this case, it's a morula. As you can see, all the blastomeres inside. The zona is still there and the corona, all right? This is a morula here. Projected on a screen. And the stage is also moved by a server, a motor, literally, that can move the stage sideways, laterally, and so forth. So very sophisticated kind of equipment, right? Which typically costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to manufacture, and then let alone the technicians, the high-end technicians to run this. Okay, so now a little more detail on in vitro. We begin with a process called hyperovulation or hyperstimulation of the ovaries, because the clinic, the in vitro clinic, needs to obtain ova, eggs, all right? So the dual process, it's kind of a gunshot industry that works on excess from the start. Obviously, for sperm, there's excess because there's an average of 100 million sperm in every ejaculate, and that, as we can intuit, is very easy to obtain in general. So the sperm is not the problem is the egg, how to obtain the egg. So they do a process, hyperovulation, which is already known in the industry for treating infertility. Clomid or some other fertility drugs are given to a woman so that she would hyperovulate a dozen, 2 or 3 dozen eggs at a time instead of just one. So these are actual photographs. Normal ovary over here. You can see the fallopian tube, the fimbriae, the ampulla. All right. The uterus over here. And this is a photograph of a hyperovulated egg. It's an extremely dangerous situation for the mother, clinically speaking, because if this ovary ruptures, it's highly vascularized with capillaries, and that would essentially cause a hemorrhage, a massive hemorrhage inside the mother, the woman, and it's a very risky situation, not to mention the pain involved in this, right? But anyway, that's the start. On the woman's side is the hyperovulation. Then they have to go in through a needle to extract these eggs. Typically, they go transvaginally with a large bore needle, syringe, and just suck them up carefully, all guided by ultrasound, of course. And they will collect, let's say, a dozen eggs, all right, just for a number. Then the fertilization itself is done in the lab, either just on the standard, let's say the minimal involvement would be on a Petri dish, or maximal with ICSI. So that at some point we have a zygote, all right, or several zygotes actually, a dozen. Let's say that we just do the standard one. We have a dozen eggs that are put in a Petri dish with a nutrient that mimics the internal environment of the female reproductive tract. And we have a dozen eggs. We put in 1 million sperm. So on average, every one of those eggs is going to get fertilized. Okay, we'll have the cortical reaction and all that. Then that zygote is now going to start development, just like any zygote in vivo, in the natural environment, and start mitosis. Normal cell division, on average every 24 hours, in a geometric progression of duplication, right? To the morula stage and eventually to the blastocyst stage, which takes on average about 5 days. That has to be done at the body temperature, which is 37 centigrade or 98.6, is it, Fahrenheit, more or less, right? So that's done in an incubator. Okay. Once that embryo reaches the blastocyst stage, which you can see here, the embryoblast, the ICM, and the trophoblast, right? Now he or she is ready to be implanted. Again, mimicking what is happening in vivo, but in vitro, in other words, done in the lab. Okay, so now comes the attempted implantation. Again, shotgun, in the sense that no one knows exactly why, but on average, when 3 to 4 embryos are inserted into the womb, on average, 1 actually implants. So the ratio is about 25 to 33% success. All right. Again, trial and error. So since we have a dozen in our hypothetical case, a dozen blastocysts, right, because we extracted a dozen eggs, which were fertilized and incubated to the blastocyst stage, so we have a dozen embryos, we can use 4, and we still have 8 to spare. Okay. I'm just going on the clinical side of things, holding back on the bioethical analysis. So on average, 3 to 4 embryos are inserted, released with a cannula into the womb, and 1 will implant. The other 3 are discarded for a number of reasons, which are still not fully understood, because it's down to the biochemical level of those blastocysts seeking to implant into the womb and doing all that biochemical signaling of trying to convince the womb that these are friend and not foe, etc. Okay, what follows next is pregnancy. Okay, hopefully for 9 months. Meanwhile, we had 8 other blastocysts left over, spare, from the dozen that were originally fertilized, right? You follow me? So 4 were inserted, 1 implanted, 3 were discarded, and the other 8, still in the incubator, are spare. What does the industry do with them? The standard is they are frozen. They're frozen into liquid nitrogen, which is about minus 180 Fahrenheit centigrade, which is almost minus 300, about 270 Fahrenheit. I don't know if you've ever seen a little video, there are videos of it's called cryopreservation, all right? Again, cryo for Greek for cold, preservation. There's nitrogen right here, right now, that we're breathing in and out, N2, which is diatomic and stable and innocuous. We breathe nitrogen in and out, gas. It doesn't do anything to us. But this is liquid nitrogen. So we know by the gas laws, we can go from solid to liquid and from liquid to gas by heating, or the reverse, by cooling. We can go from gas to liquid and from liquid to solid by cooling, right? Or pressure, or a combination of both. So under special conditions, nitrogen is liquefied, very cold, and is used for this cryopreservation. Anything that is put into liquid nitrogen essentially crystallizes instantly, all right? I remember a little video of a rose, a fresh rose, just beautiful, crisp, fresh rose that was dipped into liquid nitrogen and then pulled out. And the rose looked, after the fumes dissipated, all right, the rose looked identical to before being dipped, very fresh and crisp. But then the scientist goes like this, snaps it with a finger, and it explodes into fragments. It just pulverizes, all right? It pulverizes because it's crystallized. And so really what we have in this case is we have frozen human embryos. So at a very early stage, when we're small enough, we can actually be frozen, we can be crystallized. Are they dead or alive? Well, again, it's a biological and a clinical question, because when they're thawed out, some of them do survive the thawing process to the point of they can be implanted or inserted, and some of the thawed human embryos do implant and grow through a pregnancy to 9 months, and are born and alive and are walking in our midst today. So they're not dead because there's no coming back from the dead. They're alive, but they are in suspended animation, again, when I was in my youth at FIU studying biology, my parents were living in Panama at that time, and I used to go visit them in the summer. And one summer, I had heard that one could freeze insects and then thaw them out. So I knew how to collect bees. Have you ever collected bees, live bees? Okay, don't ever do this, but especially if you're allergic to them. My sister-in-law is allergic to bees. She goes into anaphylactic shock. But I like to catch bees. I used to, I don't do this anymore. But when I was young, so the bees have 2 sets of wings, right? And if you press the 4 wings together simultaneously, all right, the bee cannot sting you because the bee cannot turn its abdomen 180 degrees around. It has limited range on the abdomen and cannot turn the stinger around to sting, all right? So one can catch a bee typically when they're just sucking nectar on a flower, slowly come up to them and just pinch the wings and you get the bee live. Then what you do is you put a little saliva on your clothes, a little bit of saliva, and you run the bee by there and the bee will sting. But the tip of the sting of the bee is has a little barb going backwards, like a fish hook. And so it will get stuck on the clothing. Then you can pull the bee away and the barb will break off, all right? Sadly, it breaks off the tip of the abdomen so that bee will get an infection eventually and will die, all right? So yes, it's cruel, unless you have a very serious reason for doing this. My reason at the time was just curiosity. Anyway, so we get these bees, sting them, and then I can just hold them, all right? And the head does not sting, cannot pinch, because they have a sucking device for nectar. I go into a little bit of detail because then I tried it with a wasp. And the wasp stung the hell out of me. Because 2 things, the wasp, several things. First, the wasp can turn its abdomen all the way around and sting. Secondly, the wasp sting don't have a barb. It can go several times and jab and release that venom. And third, the head can also turn around, and because the wasp is a carnivore, it can bite and not suck nectar. So I learned my lesson. Do not do it with a wasp. All right. Okay. So I took those bees and put them in a jar and put them in the freezer at my parents' apartment there in Panama. My mother went to the freezer later and freaked out and says, why are these bees in the freezer? Anyway, I said, just a couple hours, Mom. So I pulled them out and they were all crumbled up, frozen, totally frozen. And I laid them out on the counter and allowed them to thaw out passively to room temperature. Took a while, maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. But after they thawed out, not all of them, but many of them just turned around and started crawling around. And then after a while, they started flying around. So yes, one can freeze small animals and then thaw them, and many of them may survive. The trick, I guess, is that they're small enough, all right? So that's what happens here. These human embryos are cryopreserved, means that they are in suspended animation, crystallized, okay?
I wonder if that's what happens with the iguanas.
Similar. similar, not as drastic. They don't actually freeze, but they go kind of in a coma. The metabolism, I guess hibernation would be the best word. All
It
right.
also happens to people. I mean, they've been able, for people who have fallen into frozen water and that they are able to be rewarmed at a certain temperature. And
Exactly.
these are people who have been, I mean, you would almost think clinically dead, but you know, their heart rate slows down into the 20s.
Exactly.
And so they are, I mean, I'm not sure frozen, but they have
hypothermia, right? Hypothermia.
Extreme hypothermia.
Extreme hypothermia. Exactly. Yeah, and in fact, on the negative side, horrific side of that, we know now from documentation that the Nazis were involved in doing some of those hypothermia experiments in the concentration camps precisely to see what was the extreme temperature that humans could tolerate, mostly to use that data to try to save their soldiers that were falling from airplanes in the middle of the war and so forth. But yeah, that went on, of course, without consent and all that. But yeah, so, and other mammals naturally go into hibernation in the north, like bears and so forth. So yeah, it can be done, all right? Risky, but it can be done. Okay, so we have frozen human embryos. My whole point about this is really that these human embryos are not dead, they're alive, but they are in suspended animation, right? Indefinitely, in principle, we really don't know how long a human embryo can last cryopreserved, crystallized that way, but some have lasted years and sometimes even decades from some clinics, okay? All right, so these are the tanks. As you can see, it's also kind of risky because at this point, what you have is a little lever here, a little metal lever that pulls out a test tube. And in that test tube are these cryopreserved embryos. And let's hope that the labeling is holding for years and so that it's still identifiable that baby Joe here belongs to Mary and Joseph, who are paying for the service, and the labels don't get mixed up and so forth. So it's I mean, technically, cryopreservation has its own challenges, especially when this is long term. And these tanks are moved around. And by the way, there is a natural, acceptable leakage, let's say, of every time the tank is open, for example, some liquid nitrogen is lost because it vaporizes. And so the liquid nitrogen has to be replaced periodically, sometimes after weeks. I don't know how long they have to be, how often they have to be replenished, but all that has technical difficulties, right? Okay, so it's kind of a risky process, but it can be done. It's been proven to work. All right, so what do we have? We started with the first attempt where 4 were inserted, 4 blastocysts were inserted, 1 implanted, 3 were discarded. And now the mother is going through a natural pregnancy itself for 9 months. But after the 3rd month or the 1st month or the 8th month, she lost the pregnancy. She had either a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage after implantation, okay? For whatever reason, she lost that pregnancy. Well, that's why the cryopreservation, because now the technicians will go back into the tank, into their test tube, and pull out 4 more of the 8, because they're 8. So they'll pull out 4 more and do a second attempt, all right? The only thing that now with the second attempt, because 1 is an average, it means that sometimes more implant and sometimes non-implant to get the 1 average, all right? So this time it happens that 3 implanted. There's an actual sonogram of 3 babies growing inside a woman's womb. So this time 3 implanted. But really they only wanted 1. The couple only wanted 1 child. And so now the industry also offers what they call selective reduction. Now the euphemisms are very important because the whole idea is to not humanize the embryo too much, lest they start having qualms about, eliminating any one of them. But because it is legal, they can reduce the pregnancy selectively. So the standard language is selective reduction. So now the couple, if they only want one or two, they can select which one they want to keep. And by the way, they can tell if the embryo is a boy or a girl, and so they can select on sex without any further analysis, because if the couple wants more analysis, of course they have to pay more. This is a for-profit industry, okay? So they can do more analysis, and they can do a karyotyping, they can do a chromosomal analysis on the embryo and see if he or she has any genetic defects that can be said, at least can be seen, visualized from a karyotyping. Karyotyping is basically doing a chromosome spread at least to see if there's a normal number of chromosomes, right? Any one of these. Or if there's an abnormal number, for example, trisomies and so forth, extra chromosomes or mismatch. So they can do chromosomal analysis, genetic analysis, which is called genetic prenatal diagnosis, PD. Okay? And the couple can select which one they want to keep.
Is that pre-implantation diagnosis?
No, it's not PGD. Yes, these are implanted. Yes, these are already implanted. These are embryos that are already growing in the pregnancy. Okay, so it's PD, prenatal diagnosis. It's not PGD. I'm going to talk about PGD in a minute, which is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So this is during the pregnancy already. But if the couple wants to pay more, depending, the industry will offer all the services that they can provide according to the technological and clinical standards of the time, okay? So it's a kind of a avant-garde, it's a very frontier industry that the latest technology is applicable. So this is what Maggie was asking, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, also known as PGD, at the morula stage. Where is the morula? Inside the mother? Morula can't implant. Remember, the blastocyst has to implant. The morula is in the incubator, right? It's the first 5 days, right? Here's the morula inside the incubator, inside the oven. Sophisticated oven has to maintain steady 37 degrees centigrade. We don't want a meltdown in here. We don't want the overheating, cooking, all right? So sophisticated technology for maintaining the highest quality possible. So the morula stage, remember these individual cells are called blastomeres, okay? And each blastomere is totipotent. And so a blastomere may be taken out, excised, again with a little needle, hollow needle, as in over here, this hollow needle can suck out a blastomere because of compaction. These individual cells are becoming smaller within the same size of the embryo as a whole, all right? Around the 3rd day, more or less. And this individual cell is sent to the lab, and it has been proven already experimentally that when a morula loses one cell, but the morula as a whole still maintains integrity, meaning that the zona and the corona is still there, that embryo may still develop into a normal human being or any other mammal. It was done with frogs first, way back a century ago, up until more recently. But the morula can afford to lose a cell or two, essentially, and still maintain the integrity enough, biological information, to become a normal human being, all right? To continue his or her development. So that blastomere is sent to the lab for more quality control, which is what I have down here. So here's the embryo biopsy, as it were, single cell, sent for genetic analysis or testing, and then it comes back that of the 4 morally that were tested, 2 passed quality control, 2 did not pass quality control. Hypothetically, it could be that all 4 pass or not, depending on what they're looking for. They're looking for trisomies or more sophisticated genetic analysis, right? So that's PGD, but it's before implantation, it's pre-implantation. All right. So in the, essentially for the IVF quality control of the embryo, if it's done before implantation, it's PGD. If it's done after implantation, it's an abortion. Now, selective reduction, of course, is a procured abortion or selective abortion in the sense that we know from experience that triplets do survive a pregnancy, their low birth weight and so forth, but they do survive, and they're triplets or quadruplets, quintuplets, septuplets, I think is the maximum of that for 7 in 1 pregnancy. But they can survive. They're high-risk pregnancies, but they can survive naturally. So if one is selected out, it's a selective process. It's a procured process, all right? The human will was engaged. So any questions on the biological clinical side? Obviously, there are many more details to this, but the big picture is there essentially to understand. I think I've covered enough biology and clinical aspects to understand the basics of the procedure. You can see why I'm calling it a manufacturing, because it's not normal fertilization. It's not natural fertilization. Okay?
So when they do the implantation, they have to inject the blastocyst.
Yes, that's why I'm calling it, it's an attempted implantation, because what they do is an insertion. They do an insertion of the embryos with a cannula, okay? But whether the embryo is actually going to implant or not, it's up to the embryo and the endometrium. They cannot, they don't, in other words, they don't literally implant the embryo like one plants a seed into the soil. That is left up to the sophisticated biochemical signaling that needs to occur there. Remember, the embryo has to convince the endometrium that he or she is a friend and not a foe, because only 50% of the genetic information is compatible with the mother, assuming that the egg came from the same woman.
So from the moment they take, the eggs, to the time, the implantation.
Right.
So they do it right away,
well,
with time, or they wait a month, or how do they do that?
Okay, so again, let's stay with the hypothetical number of 12. For 4 of them, at day 5, 4 embryos, 4 blastocysts will be inserted into the woman, okay? But the other 8 are cryopreserved in case the pregnancy doesn't survive, or in case that after a year or 2, now the couple has the firstborn child, now they want another child, or they have 8 embryos waiting in the freezer, okay, in the tanks. So they can pull out 4 more and attempt, and so on.
Yeah, one thing, for this normal ovulation,
Mm-hmm.
then the endometrium knows that, this is happening and it's getting ready for implantation.
That's right.
In this case, they are extracting the
Exactly.
the eggs that, small.
Exactly. Very good point. Exactly. So if they can do 1 attempt right away, because the 5 days that embryo is in the incubator, right, kind of mimics the 5 days that the embryo will travel from the ampulla to the endometrium. So within 5 days, the woman's endometrium is still receptive to that implantation, right? Because they're mimicking these days here. After that first cycle, all right, then they would have to wait another, on average, 28 days for her endometrium to again become hospitable and so forth.
You know, my question was, when they give the drug was flowing,
Right?
so is it normal ovulation or they just go ahead and just take the,
No, it's a hyperovulation, right?
so it's happening plus they take those,
Yeah.
injections from there.
Yeah. They will extract, they will do one cycle of hyperovulation and wait and see how many eggs actually ovulate, how many follicles actually mature, all right? Which can be anywhere from, 2 to 2 dozen or 3 dozen. It's anybody's guess how many they're gonna ovulate. But all this can be visualized with sonogram, all right? And then with the needle, they'll extract whatever mature eggs are there. Mm-hmm.
But maybe it's not that, normally gonna just go ahead and
It could be. It could be, yes. It could be that some normally do get sucked up with the, I don't know that level of detail. What happens if some of these actually rupture? I guess just kind of thinking out loud, they would have to wait. They would have to do it before rupturing. Otherwise, there's a risk that one of these may actually get into the tube. However, if the woman is not having intercourse, so what, right? It's not going to get fertilized. So, yeah, there are some details here that are critical for sure. But the standard is hyperovulation. There's no going around that, okay? Okay, well, of course, what's begging the question now is the bioethical analysis. So let's go there. Again, just to review in vitro versus in vivo. All right, in vivo meaning live where it occurs, natural ampular thing. All right, so considerations of practice, consideration of principle, I'll cover a little later, which is the fact that it's extracorporeal. It doesn't happen, the fertilization itself doesn't happen where it's supposed to happen, which is the ampulla, all right? But let's look at considerations of practice. First, the hyperovulation is extremely risky for the mother, for her health and her life. Again, because if those eggs rupture, she will have a massive hemorrhage. In fact, I have a cousin who was a social worker at South Miami Hospital. She retired recently, but she had been there for many years. And she would tell me periodically, Alfred, you wouldn't believe the number of women who come in here with ruptured ovaries because of the hyperovulation. It turns out that at South Miami Hospital, which now belongs to Baptist, they have a very successful in vitro clinic, and it's right next door, okay? In fact, that was one of the reasons why that merger between Baptist and Mercy didn't go through way back, because they didn't want to give up their in vitro clinic, which is extremely profitable. But so there's this issue of risking the woman's health or life for wanting to have a baby, okay? All right, on the man's side, the typical collection for sperm is masturbation. Of course, there are other ways that the sperm may be collected ethically, but it's painful. It involves typically a needle into the vas deferens or the epididymis, or within the intercourse itself, yes, using a condom or a perforated condom, but they can collect the sperm through the act of intercourse. But the typical easiest way to do it, because it's out of a utilitarian mentality, is just masturbation, which we consider unethical. Now there are abortions. This one, abortions due to failed implantation. Some people may say, well, that's a spontaneous abortion. That's a natural abortion, right? Because the technician inserted 4, 1 implanted, and the other 3 were just naturally discarded by the uterus. Yes, the discarding of the other 3 is natural, but the procedure itself is not natural. In other words, those 3 other embryos would not have been in there had they not been introduced artificially by a cannula. In other words, there is the human will and the human knowledge that because this is a statistical procedure, the technician and the industry as a whole knows that by inserting 4, on average, they're going to lose 3. And they still go ahead they do it knowing that. So these are not spontaneous abortions in the full sense of the word, bioethically speaking. They are procured abortions. They are willed abortions. In other words, they're willing to allow for 3 embryos to die for the sake of the one implanting. All right? And that's why bioethically, they're not spontaneous, they are procured. Yes?
You know, in that case, 3 implanted in there, and they're starting growing.
Mm-hmm.
And what stage they do this reduction?
Okay, it becomes essentially a technological question, all right? But the window has to be advanced enough to be able to tell something about them, whether they look normal or not to the sonogram and the gross morphology, all right? Typically also for the sex, because frankly, there's a lot of sex selection and it's not illegal, all right? And again, many couples want their firstborn to be a boy. And so there's that discrimination against the woman. And so probably after 12 weeks, more or less, which is when the gonads start differentiating, okay? And the penis starts differentiating also, but not too late. So the abortion is an easier procedure to do and not that risky for the other 2 siblings or the 1 sibling that is going to be left behind. Okay, so it's probably a window. I'm guessing it's going to be early in the 2nd trimester, something like that. Very early, between first and 2nd trimester.
So like a surgical type of abortion, a full-blown abortion. I don't think you want to use any chemicals in there, right?
No chemicals because it's too risky for the one they're trying to preserve or save, right? Typically, it will be a DNC, dilation and curettage. Graphically, they will go with a curette and chop up the embryos that has been selected out and then suck them out with a vacuum.
Yeah, I'm thinking that that might be pretty risky. If you're trying to preserve one.
From the hyperovulation, there's risk. Yeah. But again, keep in mind, because there are 8 that are cryopreserved, if God forbid anything goes wrong with the one they're trying to save, they can always go back and implant 4 more. And if that second one fails, they can go back and implant 4 more again. So that's why I say it's a gunshot industry. They work on excess from the start, but the excess is always on the woman. The risk is on the woman because masturbation means nothing to the man physiologically. There's no, on average, there's no threat to the man's life by masturbating, okay? But on the woman, it's always on the woman, big time. And so that's a very serious consideration. There is inequality from the get-go in vitro fertilization, okay? All right, let's move a little forward because there are several issues here that need to be addressed. The implantation, the failed implantations or abortions, procured abortions, then in the freezing and thawing of embryos, because not all embryos survive the freezing, but it's not really known until they're thawed, and not all embryos survive the thawing either, all right? And so there are deaths that occur, embryonic deaths that occur in the whole cryopreservation process. And again, these are not natural or spontaneous because this is all done by the human will. The will is engaged, and the industry knows that their success rate is nowhere near 100% on cryopreservation, okay? It's more like, I think, 18 or 20% or something like that, but don't quote me the percentage, but it's nowhere near, it's much less than half. There's another issue, the spare embryos. what if the couple, which the hypothetical dozen embryos, had their one child, survived the pregnancy, was born, now they have baby boy or girl at home, they're pleased, they're happy, and that's all they want is one child, or maybe they have a second, but they leave the other 8 or 6 or whatever they are in the freezer and the tanks, the nitrogen tanks. Well, this industry is definitely a for-profit industry, and they're willing to maintain one's embryos, but at a price. So they have to pay a price, maybe a few $100s a year, okay? But year after year, those few $100s start adding up. And if they definitely don't want to have any more children, they either abandon those embryos, or they give them to the industry, they sign off, okay, and donate them. And what the industry does now is they have found another way of making more money on this, is when they take those embryos, cryopreserve, and industry donates them, the industry donates them in quotation to research, to medical research for embryonic stem cells. Because I'll have another lecture on stem cell research, but essentially the punchline is that the embryonic stem cells is the ICM. The embryoblast, the internal cell mass, is what becomes the embryonic stem cells in research, okay? So you can see that by disaggregating that blastocyst, picture says 1,000 words, this ICM is the embryonic stem cells. So by disaggregating the blastocyst to obtain the ICM, the embryo is actually being killed. And that's bottom line, our reservation about embryonic stem cell research is that it involves necessarily the killing of a human embryo to obtain the ICM, which is the embryo proper, right? Okay. And so the in vitro industry donates, in quotation, the blastocysts, the cryopreserved blastocysts, to labs in the US and throughout the world that are doing embryonic stem cell research, all right? But I put the donation in quotation because the industry is not going to sell that embryo because that's human trafficking. The in vitro donates the embryo, but the in vitro clinic is entitled to compensation for the services, for the procedures that they've done. Because, excuse me, I, in vitro industry, have been doing all the sophisticated technique and incubating this embryo and cryopreserving that embryo in tanks for months or years, and the in vitro industry has incurred expense, the overhead of doing the whole procedure. So I'm entitled to just the compensation for that, which could be several $1,000s, you know. And so the industry gets compensated for donating the embryo. In other words, human trafficking. They're getting paid for the embryo, but they're getting paid legally.
How is an embryo considered human trafficking if an abortion is legal? I mean, I agree, it should be considered.
Because it's still human tissue, and they're selling it.
Oh, so like you can't buy a liver or buy an organ. Is that what you're saying? It's the same as trying to buy an organ for transplant? Okay. It's worse though.
The very strict regulations on organ transplantation, precisely so that no money goes across the table, so that the team that declares a person dead is separate and distinct from the team that procures those organs, that harvests the organs, okay? Precisely to have no even perception of some payback. Okay, so we're here, no. So now we have this problem of, to this day, now over 80s, it's been about 40 years now, there is at least 1 million embryos estimated to be cryopreserved in the United States alone, cryopreserved, okay? And so it has created a massive problem of what to do with these human embryos. Like I said, the clinic has found out a way of channeling a number of those. But when they're tanks, they just have too many embryos. Again, because there are no restrictions on them, on the industry, they can either throw them out as biological waste, biomedical waste, which we know will be incinerated or autoclaved, or they flush them down the toilet or whatever, because there's no regulation really on the industry on what to do with the embryos, okay? In Europe, there are more restrictions, but not here. There's also the social issue and the bioethical issue of what to do with those embryos when the parents either divorce or abandon. In fact, they dispute the embryos in divorce court, just like they dispute the house, the car, and the pets. They dispute the embryos also. You know, if she wants them implanted, but he doesn't want them implanted, and so they'll fight for them, just like things. In other words, they're not legal persons. Talking about the embryo, the blastocyst specifically frozen. They're not legal persons, right? We know they're not legal persons, but there's something physically, physiologically they exist, and therefore, in the law, there are things. They're property, okay? And they belong to whom? They belong to the parents, or the parents are together, but when the parents divorce, then they have to fight it out in court, just like they fight for other property. So that's a very sad status of these cryopreserved embryos, okay? Totally dependent on advocacy, because how can they speak for themselves? All right, another point that to me is very important, even though I seldom see it really in the literature, which is denying this child the natural right to selection, to natural selection. I want to go on this a little bit. And even not just the child, but the human species as a whole, because selection acts on the individual and ultimately acts on the population by acting on the individual, right? Because the population is made up of individuals. I'm talking about the human population. So I'll pick up that issue in a minute. I want to now switch a little bit to consider the means and the ends, because why do IVF? Obviously, we're dealing with an infertile couple, though not necessarily. Some couples are doing IVF now, or even single women, because they just don't want to go through pregnancy. They want to have their children, but they don't want to go through pregnancy. So they can surrogate their children out and then receive them 9 months later without having going to pregnancy, right? It's become kind of fashionable for the entertainment industry and artists and actors and actresses who don't want to miss a beat on the acting, but they still want to have their children. I mean, they can pay, right? All right, so we have to look at means and ends. No one questions that the end is good in principle, in that this couple or even the individual wants to have a child. Right? So we can say that the end in itself may be a good end to have a child, at least for the couple. I think some of us could argue that individuals should not raise children on their own because, again, going on natural law, we have a natural right to a father and a mother, okay, to raise us, not just generate us, but actually to raise us because of the complex dynamic that goes on with parenting. Anyway, so we can say that the end, in principle, may be a good end. You know, the couple wants a child. How about the means? This is where we get the separation, okay? Between the separation between a utilitarian mentality or a principle mentality. That the utilitarian mentality will say, yes, they have a right simply because the end justifies the means, okay? So the end justifies the means. For utilitarian, also known as pragmatism or materialism or proportionalism. There are many isms that are associated with utilitarian mindset. The principal mindset in bioethics states that no, that the means have to be justified in themselves too. That the means have to be justified, okay? So let's flesh that argument out a little bit more. For utilitarian in general, then a good end will justify whatever mean, of course, as long as the mean is a legal mean, okay? So in other words, utilitarians will say, do not break the law, which is already, it's an absolute statement. So there are internal contradictions philosophically and ethically about utilitarian, but let's assume that we allow them an absolute statement even though they're utilitarian. Do not break the law. Okay, all right, so we won't break the law as long as it's legal. The difficulty with the law is that the law does not cover every single aspect of human life, because that kind of a law would be simply too intrusive. Okay, so the law by nature, really, especially in democracies, is minimalist. Only covers the minimal requirement for some kind of a civil living in community. All right, but the law, especially in democracies, has to be minimalist in order for it to be tolerable. Okay. So what is driving this is that the couple wants to have a child. Okay. So that's their end, that's their goal. And as long as it's legal, then a utilitarian mentality will justify it. So it really plays into a market economy of supply and demand. The couple is expressing a need, or actually a desire. It's not a need, because no one needs to have a child to live, right? We have to be clear about that. Couples don't need to have children to survive and to thrive. But they want the child. So they can pay for it. So if it's legal, the industry can offer it. Then the industry will oblige, okay? So they're providing a service, a product, and it's all within a market economy. Now, you go online and you see a very pro-life perception painted out there, okay? And these are just photos at random from the internet. It presents a very, very pro-life, to the point that I have priest friends of mine who tell me, Alfred, this is pro-life. This is a couple that I married 10 years ago, and they can't have children, you know, and they can pay for it. Thanks be to God. They have the $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to pay for each attempted implantation. Why not? Okay. We can see already that it's catering to the ones who can, because insurance does not cover this. All right. This is a boutique medicine, and so they typically. No, as far as I know, they don't cover it, because, you know, it's an elective procedure. Again, they don't have to have a child in order to be healthy. Okay. Sure, but as far as I know, to this day, insurance has covered it, unless you have one of these Cadillac policies that you're paying several $1,000s a month for the policy anyway, so you might as well cover every possible aspect, okay? But so these are just some photos at random where it's presented as something that is very, very pro-life. And this is from the clinic to the front desk. In other words, this is the reception room, but it's not the lab that is behind the wall of the reception room, okay? The lab that I showed you earlier with the micromanipulators and all the freezer and the tanks and all that, okay? So it does present a very deceptive, frankly, a very deceptive picture. Doesn't speak anything about the risks of the hyperovulation, et cetera, and the risk to the embryo to begin with, because we say that on average, for every one of these, 3 siblings were killed to have every in vitro child. And now there are in vitro children walking around in the US and throughout the world to the tune of hundreds of thousands, okay, because this industry has been going on for 40 years. Many of these children don't even know they're in vitro, because their parents will absolutely not tell them. In my own family, I know one who doesn't know. We know. Okay. So moving forward, by analogy, if we use the utilitarian mentality, as long as it's legal, so for example, we can say, well, stealing may be justified for a good cause. I'm feeding my family, I'm hungry, etc. But stealing happens to be illegal. So don't steal. All right. And that's why it's wrong to steal, not because the stealing itself, but because it's illegal. And so At the end, utilitarian bioethics is legalistic. It just depends on what the law says, okay? It's legalistic. The problem is that the law cannot cover every aspect of society and should not cover every aspect of society because otherwise it will become extremely intrusive, all right? And typically, there are situations of integrity that the law does not cover. I'm talking about civil, positive, legislative law, all right? Remember, there are 3 layers of law. There is divine law, which is God's will, which we believe is reflected in natural law, which is nature, okay? What governs nature, even before we got to the planet. And then there's positive law, which is legislative, enactive, also known as, positive law by humans. Now, where does civil law or positive law stop so that it doesn't become overly intrusive? Precisely in situations of integrity at the personal, family, and social level. I'm just going to give you examples. For example, at the personal level, lying. I hope that we agree that lying is unethical. Okay. However, people lie all the time. And when was the last time you saw someone getting arrested for lying? Unless it is perjury, under oath. But just standard everyday lying, it's going on all the time. Yeah. So it's unethical, but it's not illegal. At the family level, well, how about adultery? Used to be in the books, actually. But was the last time you saw someone getting arrested for adultery? And I hope that we agree that adultery is unethical. Okay? But people don't get arrested. At the social level, how about deceptive advertisement? Some of it may be actually illegal, but there's so much deceptive advertisement going on. How about this? Does this tell me anything about hyperovulation or cryopreservation or selective reduction? Absolutely not. It's selling me a product. Deceptive and not illegal. And so that's why with utilitarian bioethics, it falls short of the mark. If we had no alternative, but to be utilitarian, we would be in a very, very hard place. But we don't have to be utilitarian. And I'm not talking about being useful, okay? There's a difference between being practical and being a pragmatist. Again, some people may shy away from delving into the meaning of words, okay? But philosophically, it's essential. And like I just mentioned, for example, the difference between pragmatism and being practical. And I'll give you a practical example. If I happen to be living nearby, but let's say I were to live down in West Kendall, right, which is very far away from St. Thomas, geographically speaking, at least at the local level. So I could come to St. Thomas either by the expressway, or I could go down to the Florida Keys and then come up US 1 and eventually meander into St. Thomas University. Obviously, it's impractical to go down to Key West first if I'm coming to St. Thomas University. That's impractical. So the practical way of coming to St. Thomas is through the expressways, right? Okay, so that's being practical.
Yeah, I just read recently something very similar to this about the utilitarian and the logistics for it happening in China with this coronavirus. There was an article that a man's wife got infected early on in January with some kind of pneumonia, but when she got sent to the hospital, they just told her that she had some kind of pneumonia, and they were charging like $3,000 a day to keep her in the hospital, and they couldn't. They were saying things like they couldn't administer this or that because she was pregnant, and throughout the whole process, she stayed in the hospital for like a week or so under this view, and in the end, she ends up dying, and because the husband couldn't keep up with the payments with all this, but in the end, they find out that what happened was that she had the coronavirus, except that hospital would not diagnose her for that because apparently they had to provide free care for that. But since the hospital didn't say that it was the coronavirus, they just kept charging the man because it was legal to charge them for their services as long as they didn't say that she had this.
So an undiagnosed infection.
Yeah, they said it was some kind of pneumonia, but they wouldn't say it was corona, so they didn't have to legally treat the person for free per se, and that was happening to a lot of people because he found out later on that they immediately cremated her so that nobody could prove that she had.
The evidence is gone.
This is like this is happening all over China.
In China,
and they also had these kits that are for the coronavirus to say that this person had the coronavirus or not, and they're like limiting the supply so they don't have to say that this person had the coronavirus. So they can just say they
will not use the kit on purpose.
They had some kind of other disease like pneumonia or something.
Right. So the way you're describing it would be, in my mind, an application of utilitarianism, right? Save the institution at the sacrifice of the people.
It's like morally wrong because they stopped care for that woman because the man couldn't keep paying the services because they didn't want to work for free. After all, according to the government, they would have to work for free if they diagnosed her.
Right, and the institution would have had to absorb the cost, which in this case would be the state. Yeah, I mean, there's utilitarian examples all over the place, all the time, right? There is. So the alternative that I'm proposing is the principle bioethics, where, bottom line, the means also have to be justified. The means have to be justified, okay? And so we look at whether the means in themselves are ethical or not. And when we see here is the couple wants a child, fine. But how to obtain that child, how to come about that child, also needs to be justified, particularly in this case of IVF, because it involves the lives of other people. Not only involves the life of the couple themselves, but it involves the life of the child too, of the children. Okay? So at the end of the day, IVF in the bioethical analysis fails at the level of means mostly, right? It's a huge manipulation of human life, particularly of the women involved, not only the mom or the mom-to-be, but also the female embryo, which on average is going to be selected out simply for the simple reason of being female, being a woman. So the burden is on her. And I want to pick up now the last point that I had mentioned, because I've gone over this already, is this issue of natural selection at the level of the individual and at the level of the species. See, with the natural process, there are two levels of selection that we have. which are extremely powerful. And they are truly gates, okay, for they are natural quality controls. For example, at the level of fertilization and at the level of implantation. I mentioned before that for a human ejaculate to be considered potent, capable of fertilizing, on average, should have about 100 million sperm. But they're only fertilizing one egg, so the selective pressure against human sperm is about 100 million to 1. That is an astronomical selective pressure, okay? So that on average, the most vigorous sperm will get to fertilize that one egg. And that most vigorous sperm, on average, will have the best DNA, the best genome, okay? Because it is the genome that is expressing, that is making that sperm most vigorous by way of capacitation and the acrosome reaction and everything that needs to function on the sperm to be the first one to get there, to fertilize, to get to the ampulla. So all this selective process is denied automatically in vitro. Certainly a technician under the microscope looking at semen is not going to have the level of sophistication with 100 million sperm and to select the most vigorous sperm every single time. It's just impossible, all right? At best, they'll look at the gross morphology of the sperm and just make sure that it has a tail, all right, or that it has a functional tail. But there's no way that a technician under a microscope in the lab can certify the acrosome, the tip of the sperm, to be actually functional, to make that acrosome reaction to be the best one to bore through the two layers to get to the actual egg membrane, all right? And so, in short, this selective process, this gate, quality control that occurs naturally is obviated, is discarded in vitro. So that on average, these in vitro babies are not necessarily the healthiest that they could have been through a natural process. Okay, so it's denying them this natural selection. Number one. Number two, at implantation, after the fertilization has been done, because of the attempted implantations that fail, we understand that there's another gateway there, which on average is a 2-to-1 ratio because the embryo either implants or not. Okay, so that's a failure, that's a switch, that's an on-off switch. The embryo either implants or not, so 50% on average. In fact, we have a spontaneous abortion ratio of about 50% globally during 9 months of pregnancy. That's why I've mentioned before, on average, we all have a sibling that we've never known. Hopefully, we'll make him or her in eternal life, okay? But on average, 50% of human pregnancies never make it to term. So there's a second gateway there, second quality control, if you will. And from those embryos that have been rescued after a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage and have been examined, with the vast majority of them have genetic defects, like 90-95% of them have genetic defects. So we can see it's another quality control after fertilization. We talk about the embryo, specifically defective embryos that fail to implant because of the defects. This is nature. That is denied to that human being in vitro, okay? Now again, psychologically, and yes, even spiritually, think of the couple who's having natural losses versus in failed implantations versus artificial losses through IVF, okay? The couple who is having a natural loss early on, like spontaneous abortion, within the first couple of weeks of pregnancy, most of the time, most of those women don't really know that they're pregnant. It's too early. It's a failed implantation. they may have an intuition that they got pregnant or not because of that particular intercourse they had, but they don't really have the symptoms yet to know for sure they're pregnant. So typically they think that they are just late in their period, and they're having a late period, whereas they're having a spontaneous abortion. So psychologically, it's not the impact of what happens later with the miscarriage of a wanted baby, which is that they won't go through a mourning process, which is understandable because they wanted this baby that was lost, okay, in a later miscarriage. Whereas in this process, they're perfectly aware, the couple is, if the industry was honest with them and told them about the statistical 25% success rate, then they know that for every child that implants, they're killing 3 other siblings, okay? So the stress, the burden, the psychological burden on dealing with that by going through in vitro against the natural process. Yes, Luis?
You may want to add another layer of selective pressure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure on average, older women, maybe in the late 30s or early 40s, are applying for this procedure. Unless they got their eggs frozen when they were in their 20s. These eggs already have some aging.
Yes.
Naturally, and it's proven that the viability changes.
On average, from 32 to 35 years of age, on the woman, it starts going exponentially. Natural losses and aneuploidy, so chromosomal abnormalities. The typical one that survives is trisomy 21, otherwise known as Down syndrome, simply because it's the smallest chromosome and there's least genetic information there. It's compatible with pregnancy, it's compatible with life, it's viable, but with abnormalities. They tend to get selected out also through the PGD and PID, all right? But it's true that there's again, existentially, older women are going through in vitro, either because they froze their eggs in their 20s, or simply now in their 30s, once they have their careers and whatnot, now they want to get pregnant. And so there is that added aging of the eggs. I'm sorry. These things drive me crazy. I'm sorry. Let me advertise me. See, deceptive, they caught me. Right. This issue, since you bring it up, I want to address it a little bit because it has a big impact on women today who obviously want to have a career and they go through college and so forth, but they're postponing the reproductive. I was planning on touching in NFP, which is coming up in the second half, but they postpone their procreation to later in life. But those eggs are, sadly, they're older, and because they're arrested at meiosis 1, when they go through meiosis 2, the pair of chromosomes, the sister chromatins, fail to separate, and they stick together, and that's what causes the aneuploidy, so that some of the eggs will have more chromosomes, and some of the eggs will have fewer chromosomes. Typically, the ones with fewer chromosomes don't survive, but the ones with more may survive to fertilization, and that's where we get the chromosomal abnormalities, okay? And then the woman is put into the added burden now that she knows that her child is abnormal, whether to kill that child or not, because again, it is legal to kill abnormal children in the womb. So you see all the complications that come on to the couple, even in the best case scenario meaning a married couple who just cannot have children because of some physiological, it could be incompetence on his side, or it could be blocked tubes on her side, who knows, but just, minimal infertility issues of a married couple who plan to stay together for life and raise their children to the best of their ability and so forth. Then this industry affords any kind of variation from that, let's say, optimal scenario of a married couple wanting to have their children, okay? What do I mean by variations? Well, certainly single people But not only single women through in vitro can have their children, all right, but single men can also have their children, because this is an industry that has catalogs. And on the catalog, they can sell egg and sperm, all right? And they'll tell you everything about the donor who was compensated for their donation, except their name and address. They'll tell you their height, their weight, they'll tell you their IQ, they'll tell you their profession, they'll give you as much background possible so that you can pay for the quality of that sperm or that egg according to the characteristics of the donor, all right? So homosexual couples can have their children, single men can have their children, because they just, not only do they buy the egg, they can use their sperm or some other person's sperm, any possible combination. That embryo can be implanted into a surrogate woman, meaning that she will carry the pregnancy and then give the child, hypothetically, give the child to the couple or the individual who's paying for the process. So hypothetically, these in vitro children can end up with, let's say, a biological mother who donated the egg, a surrogate mother who gestated the embryo, a biological father who donated the sperm, and then the financial couple who pay for the procedure. So these children can have up to 5 parents, 3 mothers and 2 fathers, or any combination of the above. Now, since I do natural law ethics, in other words, nature tells us there are natural rights that precede positive rights. I have a natural right to breathe, whether the state allows me to breathe or not. Okay. Likewise, because the natural process of fertilization is by a man and a woman in the ampulla and so forth, I have a natural right to that process, because there's a selective process that guarantees me, on average, to be the healthiest person that I can be when I'm born and beyond. So in vitro denies that process. In vitro also denies me the natural right to have one mother and one father who will raise me, who are my biological parents. So from natural law perspective, vitro denies all those rights to the individual, even before we get to the positive rights, okay, at the natural law level. And that's why the bottom line conclusion for in vitro, at least from a bioethical, from a principle bioethics, is that it's a gross manipulation of human life. And even though the end in itself may be laudable about wanting to have a child, that child, again, is being manufactured and is being obtained by every means possible. So again, this mentality of wanting what I want, when I want it, and I can pay for it. So it's absolutizing my wants simply because I can pay for them. And they happen to be human beings. And I will give them the best love and care that I can, but you know, I got what I wanted, which is a child. On top of this, what we find is that existentially, how many of you have ever heard of a couple who was infertile, and once they had a child at home, either through in vitro or through adoption, whatever, but now they have baby at home, they become pregnant? Have any of you ever heard of that? Okay.
Several times.
So where was the supposed infertility? Where was it? It was up here. It was obviously not physiological because now they're naturally pregnant, but it was psychological. And there is evidence that psychologically, a couple sometimes are so intent on having children that that is blocking their fertility. And it's psychological. Aside from the issues of tight pants, like you mentioned earlier, you know, tight shorts, I'll get into that in NFP, and high heels and all that actually affect the fertility of a couple. Right? Yeah, I'll get to it. I'll get to it. But conversely, there's a case in sexual assault and rape that, so the fertility level, no, actually this, I'm going to save this for NFP because I see the clock ticking here and we're already at 11:30. Since we're going to do NFP in the second half, I think a number of these topics will dovetail into NFP, where we'll talk about the natural way of trying to conceive. Okay, let me, because with my enthusiasm, I see that I'm spilling into the NFP topics. Bottom line of in vitro fertilization. From a principal ethics perspective, we cannot really justify it because of the gross manipulation of not only the child, but the parents also, whether they are conscious of it or not. In the end, it does fall into the eugenics mentality of manufacturing humans, the quality control that is exceedingly obvious in the industry, right? And the more than the couple can pay, the more quality control they can have on that child. So little by little, this is affecting the human population, which right now is a very small percentage, you know, to say a few 100,000 versus the 7 billion that we are. But with time, that will have a greater and greater impact on the gene pool of the human population, especially when many of these in vitro children, who are now adults in the reproductive ages, don't even know that they're in vitro. I'll finish with this. There was a clinic in the Midwest, this was years ago, saw it on the news, in the Midwest of the US. It's more rural areas and there's not a high concentration of urbanicity, and therefore clinics and hospitals are more spread out over regions. But there was a town, a small town, where there were young couples, and one of the couple was infertile. They had other friends and so forth, and so they decided to go to the local in vitro clinic. And sure enough, she got pregnant, they got pregnant, and they had their child, and they were very happy. And so in their friendship with other couples, it turned out that another couple that were friends of theirs, they were also infertile. So naturally, this couple made the recommendation of the successful clinic, where the second couple went, and sure enough, they got pregnant also. And the first couple had, I'm going to say a boy, and the second couple had a girl. The fact is that they had different sexes for their children. And these children are growing up together from two separate couples. Eventually, these two children, who were only maybe within a year apart of age, fall in love with each other, and now they're planning on marrying. It turns out that the donor sperm came from the same man, because this clinic happened to have very potent sperm from a donor man who has donated to many clinics in the US his sperm, because he happens to have very potent sperm. And so these two kids, who are now young adults and falling in love and they want to marry, are half brother and sister. They come from the same sperm. They don't know it. Mm-hmm. And then when their children start coming out abnormal, they're wondering what's going on. But the industry allows that to happen, because it will not tell you who the donor is. They'll give you all of his characteristics, but they will not tell you his name and address.
But they do give you a number or something, right? So could the couple stop compare the number? Don't they give you some kind of ID number for a donor?
Maybe now they do that, maybe. Back then, because this was many years ago that I heard it on the news, that was certainly not the case.
I heard there was a Law and Order episode with a similar.
Oh, really?
Story.
They turned it into a novel already. Yeah.
Pulled from the headlines.
But you see, the industry is not really regulated that way, and so they're just supplying a product, right? And so these are the big challenges. This is kind of this is just a statement from previous development, that there's no gradation to the humanity of a human being, you know, from conception to death. we may have different stages of development for sure, evidently from one cell to trillions of cells, and from totipotent to fully differentiated, but humanity as such may not be gradated. If we were to gradate humanity, we would say that some humans are more humans than others. And then the less humans can be experimented on. And we had a very sad consequence on that last century, which actually led to a Second World War, right? And so we have to be really, really attentive to not dehumanize the human at whatever stage of development that we're at. Otherwise, we're going to commit the same mistake again. All right, I'm going to stop here. Let's take a break, unless you have questions or comments on this. I know I've given you a lot in a short time again. I'll reflect a little bit. When we come back from the break, we can pick it up. Otherwise, I'll move into NFP. All right. And so I'm going to pause the recording now. Take about 10 minutes. Back at about 11:40, okay? Pause recording. Okay, everyone, welcome back then. We're going to continue here. The lights. Putting these two technologies together, contraception and in vitro fertilization, we see that basically at the level of principle, they are counterparts to each other. In the case of contraception, artificial contraception, the couple can have their unitive aspect and blocking out the contraceptive aspect, the procreative aspect. Whereas with in vitro, we can see that the couple can have the procreative aspect without the unitive aspect. In other words, they may or may not have intercourse, but it has nothing to do with the fertilization itself. So they kind of complement each other, these two, and we can see that these two, whether it's artificial contraception or in vitro fertilization, they're heavily dependent on technology, whether it's simple technology as a condom or sophisticated technology as the IVF process itself, okay? But they're heavily dependent on technology to the point that without the technology, neither one can happen. And so that's where I want to go now, precisely without the technology. In other words, what is the natural way? In other words, if there was no alternative to getting pregnant than to use IVF or artificial contraception to avoid the pregnancy, we would be in a very, very different scenario. But the fact is that there is a natural way to either achieve or avoid pregnancy. And that's what we call natural family planning, okay? So again, consistent with the whole issue, we're gonna go through NFP, first the biology of it and the medical side, and then the bioethical analysis. I had this just from last year's slides in case, okay, so yeah, I did cover pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, I covered that. Sometimes you'll see it as PIGD, but pretty much the acronym is PGD, all right? Surrogate motherhood, I already mentioned it in passing. It is essentially, oh, sorry, thank you. It's this cable. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, it's a cable that's very sensitive here. All right, so surrogate motherhood is essentially carrying the pregnancy for someone else. This in itself has brought on a bunch of issues. Maybe about 2 or 3 years ago now, there was a case, very famous case from the couple in Australia. I don't know if you heard about that one. This couple happened to be a very rich couple from Australia, and they did IVF, but she didn't want to carry the pregnancy, or maybe she couldn't. I forget if it was medical or just that she didn't want to be pregnant. But the clinic sent the embryos out to Singapore. Okay, now what they do is this surrogate motherhood also is particularly challenging with regards to bioethics because it has the tendency to exploit poor women. In this case, typically they go into Latin America, the clinics will go to Latin America or Asia and find poor women and pay them maybe a few $100s to carry the pregnancy. Now, a few $100 for this woman may represent a whole year's earning or 10 years earning. The one in Singapore, the case in Singapore was a young lady who sold candy in the streets of Singapore. And so a few $100 probably represented 5 years worth of work, okay? The clinic implanted 2 embryos into her. And after the protocol and the follow-up with ultrasound and so forth, it turns out that one embryo was normal, but the other one had Down syndrome, okay? And so the couple, the Australian couple who was paying for it all, said, well, we want to keep the normal child, but you can select out the Down syndrome child, okay? And the Singapore woman said, no, I'm not going through an abortion. I'm not selecting out the other one. And so it became an international tiff also because at this point, by the clinic sending those embryos out to Singapore, there are no laws that restrict that in Australia, but apparently they are, in hindsight, they are in Singapore. And the law in Singapore favored the woman, the pregnant mom. And she was protected by Singapore law to keep both children, but the other couple didn't want to keep both children. And then, but the Australian couple who was paying for the whole procedure and whose children they were biologically, right, didn't want that other child either for themselves, the Down syndrome child, or to exist. They wanted to kill that child, all right? And she said no. She ended up suing them for I don't know how many millions of dollars for the raising of the child until the child will live, because that was indeed a burden existentially to raise that Down syndrome child. So she gave birth to both, gave the natural child, the normal child to the Australian couple, and kept the Down syndrome child. She went from being poor to being a millionaire from the suit that she put on this couple. But she said no, and so it happens that sometimes, at some point, many of these women bond with their surrogate child and want to keep it, him or her, all right? And so it's very challenging, but the industry, they're predatory mostly on poor women in underdeveloped countries, okay? Who are otherwise young and healthy, and of course you dangle a few $100s in front of them and go for it. Similar to what's happening with organ trafficking in India and other parts of the world, that people will sell a kidney for a few $100s or maybe a few $1,000s. Different is the snowflakes. You may have heard about snowflake babies. That's a reference to the crop preservation. Okay, snowflake babies are babies that are being rescued. Okay, so this is the PID thing. Oh, so I guess I saved it back then. I'm sorry, I may have it in Thailand. Okay, anyway, here's a reference. You can look it up. It describes the whole case. Snowflake babies. This is interesting because number of couples who are infertile are saying, well, why go through the in vitro process ourselves? Maybe we can adopt some of these frozen human embryos, the cryopreserved embryos, especially if the parents no longer want them, if the parents have abandoned them or they really don't want, they already have their child, etc. What to do with the frozen human embryos, right? Well, a number of infertile couples are wanting to adopt those embryos. May they be adopted bioethically? The church has not made a definitive statement on it. So while the church doesn't make a definitive statement on it, one can argue either for or against it. The original document that condemned in vitro fertilization, I should have mentioned this, is Donum Vitae in 1987. And this came out of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Back then it was Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI. Here's the document in English. All right, you can download it for free in whatever language you like. But Donum Vitae is the one that said essentially no to in vitro fertilization, whether it's autologous, meaning from the, or homologous, meaning from the same parents, the biological parents, or heterologous by buying the sperm or the egg, for all the reasons that I mentioned. Then there was a follow-up, which is called Dignitatis Personae. Dignitas Personae. Dignitas Personae. Also from the congregation, and this was in 2008, I want to say 2008. Yeah, Luis Ladaria's a Jesuit. He taught me when he was a mere priest at the Gregorian University. Yeah, 2008. Then he went on to become the prefect, well, first the bishop, and then the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, otherwise known as CDF, right, in Rome, at the Vatican. It's the branch of the Vatican that is in charge of maintaining the doctrine of the faith, the consistency or the integrity of the doctrine of the faith over the years and the centuries. Anyway, they came up with this document in 2008, Dignitas Personae, where it talks about further manipulations of the human life and human embryo and so forth. And it falls just short. It just says we don't see a way how embryo adoption could be justified, but they stop short of condemning it outright. And so going back to Alphonsus Liguori, who was kind of the father of moral theology in Catholicism back a few centuries, couple of centuries, it's called probabiliorism, when there are two opposing views on moral theology, on a moral issue, and the Vatican has not made an official declaration either way. Theologians and the public at large is free to hold and to sustain either position, all right? It is essentially what we call questiones disputate, disputed questions that have not been resolved yet, all right? So when there's no official statement from the Vatican either way on a moral issue, then as long as there are solid arguments, people can behave either way, either for or against. So applying that principle to rescuing the possibility of rescuing frozen human embryos, the snowflakes concept came up, all right? And there are now a number of snowflake babies walking around that were rescued from the in vitro tanks, from the crop preserve tanks, implanted. Many of them are twins because they will implant again 2, 3, or 4, and sometimes 2 implant to actually go through. No, it's very similar to a born adoption. This is essentially an unborn adoption, okay? Now, from the principled perspective, we have to be careful. It's not as simple as adopting a born child, because a born child is already here on Earth. It's, it's outside the womb. Here we're talking about implantation, and how about the failed implantations? So we have to justify the risk of the life of the embryo, that the risk of the life of the embryo, we don't have a right to risk the life of that embryo beyond what is the natural risk. There's a natural risk to life, okay? And what do we look at? We look at failed pregnancies. We look at the rate of spontaneous abortions or miscarriage in the general population, which, like I've said, globally is about 50%. It depends on who you read, but more or less about 50%. In other words, how does that translate into just normal English? About half of human pregnancies never make it to term naturally, without any intervention. So they're not procured abortions, they're natural spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, same event, just later on in the pregnancy, right? Okay, so obviously there's no guilt or fault involved in a natural loss, unless the woman, the pregnant mom, was totally irresponsible about her pregnancy, you know, that she went horseback riding for 3 hours at 7 months pregnant or something like that, not recommended, okay? That's irresponsible behavior. But if she really did nothing to lose the pregnancy, there's absolutely no guilt involved. All right. So how do we justify? We take that 50%, and now it's informative. We may not risk the life of this blastocyst more than the natural risk, which is 50% globally. What does that mean? That when we attempt the implantation, we should only attempt, how do we get a 50% implantation rate?
So we have to wait for technology to improve?
Yeah, but
keep them growing?
Always, yes. But now we're thawing and implanting, okay? So what I'm trying to get at is that in order to rescue these embryos, it should only be one at a time. In other words, if we insert only one embryo, if we insert more than one, there's a risk of losing more on one. So the ratio is not 50%, it's less than 50%. We're endangering the life of those embryos more than 50%, not justifiable. How do we endanger the life of the embryo up to 50%? By only inserting one. That one either implants or not, that's the 50% there, because that one only has a chance of implanting or not implanting. So as long as we insert only one, we're not endangering the life of that embryo more than the natural risk of pregnancy, of human pregnancy. Follow the argument?
But again, the statistics, I don't think that they match there. Because in that 50%, we're not just dealing one event at a time, you either implant. We are using a statistical whole population. But in this case, we are using the two options of one event. You either implant or not. But the reality is that depending on the technology level that you do the procedure, you will have higher chances of implantation. So you have to develop some statistics on that other side of artificial implantation to justify that there's a 50% chance.
Agreed, but consider that the technology itself, at this level, I would say, of the whole in vitro process, the technology of inserting embryos into the womb is the least sophisticated. Essentially, it's a cannula, you know, with 4 embryos inside. In the conditions, in the clinical conditions that don't, they're not conducive to infection and things like that, you know, but of the whole in vitro process, in my mind, the least sophisticated is inserting the embryos. And I agree with you that forever we're at the quandary of going from a probabilistic model to a deterministic model, because this particular embryo that has been inserted into this particular womb either implants or not. So that's a determined human embryo. But we're using a statistic, but that's the challenge of medicine always. When I go to Dr. Cueja for my cavity, he will say, well, there's a 90% chance that we'll get the cavity or a 5% chance that you lose the tooth. But until the process actually happens, you know, it's a statistic, right?
But they do it because that way, because of economics. But you know, they have to provide, you know, like higher chance of implementation. That's why they use.
Yes, exactly. That's why I say the industry is a shotgun industry. They start with excess to begin with, and so they can spare the embryos. In fact, the language is talked about is spare embryos. All right, yeah. But in this case, no, unless So this is doing in vitro. This is trying to justify ethically snowflake rescue or snowflake adoption. Obviously, not every snowflake clinic follows principles. They may also follow utilitarian and take 2 or 3 or 4 like the industry does, like the in vitro industry does, to have a higher success rate of at least implanting 1. But they're not using principles bioethics, okay? They're still rescuing. The end is good. They want to rescue, they want to adopt these children, but the means, this is how in the means we could justify. Right. Exactly. Yeah, and they are rescuing indeed the embryos, but they're risking the death of those embryos at a higher rate. So we, in a principled situation, could justify it. Maggie, you had a question or a comment?
Well, the intent to me is critical, especially on the part of the parents who are adopting the embryo.
Yes.
Because I would say, if I were going to do something like that, I would probably want to. Because I would say, I'm fine with twins. I have no intention of selectively reducing anything. And I'd be happy to have 2 babies. And the intent is to have 2 healthy babies. So,
right. Yeah, but the comeback would be do them sequentially. Look, they can be 9 to 10 months apart, right? They don't have to be, because in the twinning, not only is a high-risk pregnancy because of twinning, all right? You're endangering the life of one or the other above the 50% rate, okay? Because now 1 implants or 2 implants.
twins have a high survival rate.
They do, but it's not as high as singleton. No, maybe correct me, Siobhan. Is the risk-free? Is it equivalent?
Multiple pregnancies, there's an inherent increased risk, but that would just be anecdotal.
Right, but
I don't know.
right, but
From a
that's
genetic perspective, they have issues. It's a logical.
I mean, typically, yeah, it's a low birth weight and so forth. That's even if it's just 2. Just taxing the mother with 2 placentas instead of 1, etc. They can have them sequentially, why not sequentially? The other thing too is the couples who are adopting, they don't necessarily have to be infertile couples. They can be fertile couples. They can have children already. They are trying to rescue, they're trying to adopt a child. But they're only adopting they're adopting unborn instead of born.
Would there be a chance that the lab would say, we don't do 1 at a time, you have to do 2 or more?
They could be.
Is that something
They could be, and then they have to negotiate with a lab or get a lab that does do 1 at a time, Yeah, I mean, you have all kinds of variations on the theme, which again points out to the inherent difficulty of in vitro, that one way or another, it's manipulating a human life that is already at high risk. Once this zygote, once this egg was fertilized in a lab, that zygote is automatically at high risk, no matter how you cut it, for all the subsequent manipulation that needs to go on for that to become a born human being. Necessarily depending on so many procedures and manipulations.
Does that rationale apply when we were talking earlier about co-joined twins and trying to separate them, the technology, the need? So
It could.
So you would not, so the church would recommend against not separating co-joined twins?
Of course, what do we have to do forever distinguish which conjoined twins are we talking about? Are they conjoined at the head? Are they conjoined at the abdomen? Do they have common vital organs or separate? Is it the case of those 2 girls that I showed you that were 2 definitely independent heads, and from the neck down there was a single body? There's no way of separating that, right? Or the other 2 twins were just joined at the cranium, which was a relatively simple separation, but you had essentially 2 heads and 2 bodies.
Father, what I'm asking is to be inconsistent. I mean, the idea that you can do it, and yes, there are distinctions.
Right.
Okay, so.
It depends how much they're sharing, and it is a technological, it could be hypothetical. Consider this, Siobhan. It's the 2 girls, right, that shared a common body. What if hypothetically at some point technology was able to supply a support system, a vital support system for that head? Should we then separate? Esa cuestión es disputada.
One of the heads
Yes, what does happen?
You know,
Should we sever it?
brain injury.
My first intuition, as you mentioned that, I would say sever the cadaver and bury the head. Sever the cadaver, that head has died, that person has died.
It just seems to me that some technology is okay, other technology is not okay.
Absolutely,
And so the
yes.
issue becomes,
What's at stake?
well,
What's
maybe
at
what's
stake?
at stake or the technology, if you could, your unitive process, if it seems to me that if the whole idea of procreation and marriage, and for some reason, and it's not a psychological block,
Right.
sort of, so if you could correct for some of these problems, then the technology would be okay.
Yes.
So, you know, so then it's not really the technology that's the problem, it's the complications of the technology.
Yes.
Technology inherently is not evil or
No,
unethical.
technology is not evil. You know, the same procedure, the same DNC is used either to kill a living human embryo or to evacuate a dead embryo who can now cause sepsis to that woman, right? It's the same exact procedure. You got to dilate and you got to curate either the living or the dead embryo. So the technology itself is neutral. Nuclear power can be used either for a nuclear bomb or to electrify an entire city. It's how it's used precisely. It's the how, the means, which is a human means. Technology remains neutral. All right, now let's move on to, so the possibility of rescuing human embryos, possibly. Oh, the other condition here, in addition to being one at a time, at least for the 50-50 ratio, is that should also be a married couple, right? And not single men or women using a surrogacy and so forth, because again, the natural right to have one father and one mother to raise, I think it's my knee that's doing it, to raise that child. So a married couple, on average, everything else, all things being equal, has a better chance of raising this child and providing for the child. It's not the pregnancy, it's the 20 years that come after the pregnancy, okay, of raising the child in a healthy environment where they can provide for that child, which continues to be dependent until he or she becomes an adult. And if they're Latin, it may be 30 or 40 years before you get rid of the kid. All right, now, different is artificial insemination. Because artificial insemination is artificial in the sense of inserting the sperm into the womb, but the fertilization is in vivo. So AI, not artificial intelligence, but artificial insemination, okay, is in vivo fertilization. It's not in vitro fertilization. So don't be confused with artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization, okay? The distinction is not without significance because here the fertilization itself is happening in vivo. So this is a very good example of making the distinction between assisting procreation or substituting procreation. In vitro substitutes procreation, whereas artificial insemination assists procreation. But the procreation itself, meaning the fertilization event, is occurring in the ampulla if it's going to occur or not, okay? So artificial insemination may be justifiable for proportionate reasons, meaning that the couple is infertile and it be incompetence. It could be all the way from the background that he's unable to obtain an erection, but he's producing semen. So we got to get that semen in there somehow. And so a cannula is used to insert the semen, all right? But the semen is competent, or it may be sperm insufficiency. Maybe he's only producing a few thousand instead of a few million. And so that's a way of getting the semen in there. Okay?
Well, wouldn't you think that a male that only produced 1,000 sperm would sort of be by definition inadequate, and that it might not be the healthiest thing genetically?
As far as
we were talking about earlier,
it could be.
Interfere with the natural selection process.
It could be, but it could be the level of the prostate and not the testes. You know, maybe the prostate is not producing sufficient semen, or maybe for whatever reason the testes are not producing enough sperm, but the sperm that is producing is competent. All right, it's just low in number. So really, we have quantity and quality here, right? Both, yeah. So many factors, but all I'm saying is that in principle, artificial insemination is assisting reproduction, is not substituting it, okay? And so it may be justifiable. It's not intrinsically evil, unlike in vitro, because in vitro is substituting a vital natural process. Mm-hmm.
It has to be done with the husband's sperm, not a donor's sperm.
Yes, of course, because that maintains the integrity of that marriage, and it doesn't become a cellular adultery, okay? It maintains the integrity. In other words, again, the principle of totality, that I am myself and my organs. And so the woman is herself and her eggs, and the man is himself and his sperm. Mm-hmm. Maintains the integrity of the marriage itself, and it's truly, fully a marital act, and there's no third party or no third sperm involved in that marital act. Oh, and here's where, speaking of the marital act, because this could technically separate the unitive from the procreative, right? In other words, the intercourse would have happened prior, but there is an ethical way of obtaining sperm, and I alluded to it earlier, is by having intercourse with one's wife with a perforated condom. So the condom here is used not as a prophylactic, not as a contraceptive, but simply as a bag to collect sperm, to collect semen, all right? And that's why the perforation, because the perforation then is graphically, physically, literally allowing for some sperm to get through, in the possibility that there would be fertilization. So it's just saying that this act of using a condom is not being used for contraceptive purposes, but rather as a bag to collect the semen. But the fact that it's perforated is demonstrating graphically that it's not being used as a contraceptive. Okay? In other words, we want to avoid schizophrenia here of contracepting and not contracepting simultaneously, right? Dual intentions simultaneously are not normal. All right, so that's the way that it may be done. It may be justifiable for sufficient reasons, meaning that typically sperm incompetence. Moving forward, finally, NFP. All right, so NFP is, as the word implies, is natural. So already there's the one advantage, the one obvious advantage is that in principle, there's no cost involved. Okay, so you're saving either on the pill or the condom or the IVF, which can mount for a few dollars to a few $1,000s. But of course, that's not the reason why one should use NFP. Why should you use NFP? Simply because it's natural. And so it turns out that there are symptoms of ovulation. Again, going back to the basic idea that if there's no fertile egg to be fertilized, no mature egg to be fertilized, then the couple can be copulating 24 hours a day. And if there's no egg to be fertilized, there's no fertilization, all right? And therefore no pregnancy. So the bottom line about NFP is for the woman to be able to detect with confidence her time of ovulation. And there are at least 10 symptoms of the woman's body that point toward ovulation. 10 symptoms that typically are pre-ovulatory, okay? And of these 10 symptoms, 3 are primary symptoms and 7 are secondary symptoms. So we're going to look at that. That's the biological side first, and then briefly, finally, at the bioethical issue. So here we go. The symptoms of ovulation, 3 primary and 7 secondary. The 3 primary: basal body temperature, the activity of the cervix, and the cervical mucus. Okay. So the basal body temperature, the BBT, we all have a body temperature, which on average is that 96.8 thing, or no, 98.6, right? 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37 in centigrades. And we normally have that temperature at rest. So the best time to take this BBT is when the woman is resting, typically like early in the morning, let's say 5, 6 in the morning, before she becomes active, because once we become active, our temperature, our BBT starts fluctuating back and forth, up and down, and it may give a false positive. The point about this is that at ovulation, there's a slight rise in temperature, anywhere from 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit, a peak, all right? There's a slight peak in the BBT when the woman is ovulating, and it can be anywhere between 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit. Now there are digital thermometers that measure down to centesimals. So that 1 degree, that 0.5 degree may be detected with today's technology, okay? But like I say, it has to be done when taking the temperature has to be done when the woman is at rest, before she becomes active in the morning, whenever, because then that temperature is going to start fluctuating and give false positives. All right, so a little cumbersome, but anyway, the symptom is there, and it's primary because it's associated directly with the event of ovulation. The other 2 are more reliable. The activity of the cervix itself. So let's see. Yeah, let's go here. Here is the cervix, which is a circular muscle. It is a smooth muscle, meaning it's not attached, it's not skeletal, it's not attached to bone. We have no control over it. And it's a boundary, it's a gate between the vagina and the uterus. So the uterus is truly the inner parts of the woman's reproductive system tract. And therefore, it's a very important gate to keep out foreign objects like bacteria, viruses, and anything else, okay? So the cervix normally, when the woman is not ovulating, is shut tight. It's called firm, and it can be detected by a finger tact analysis, and it tends to be, it drops and is firm and shut tight and slightly off center, right? On the inside also there's a plug of mucus that I'll talk about in the 3rd symptom, but I'm talking about the cervical, the activity of the cervix. When the woman is ovulating, that cervix dilates somewhat, very little, maybe just a millimeter or 2, if that, but it's detected by the tact of the finger, typically the middle finger, which is the longest one on the hand. And the woman can, with a self-analysis, can detect the activity of the cervix to see if it's low and firm or high and soft and moist, all right? Those are kind of key characteristics, and also whether it's more central or off-center between the infertile time and the fertile time. Because what happens, I mean, there's a synchrony here that the whole reproductive tract of the woman during ovulation is gearing toward the possibility of fertilization. And so it has to facilitate the passage of the semen and the sperm by becoming more open. And these are actual photographs that you can see online, and more moist because of the mucus, and allow the sperm to actually go through, right? Okay, so that's the activity of the cervix, which, like I say, can be detected by a self-analysis of the woman. And hygiene is very important here. So important for her to wash her hands and so forth and detect that activity. While she is there, she will pick up some of the mucus surrounding the cervix, and then we can look at the quality of the mucus itself. And that is, of the 3 primary symptoms, the cervical mucus is the most accurate one. These are primary symptoms because they are directly related to the ovulation events, okay, to what is happening in the female tract because of ovulation, the hormonal cycling that is happening there. Okay, so let's look at the cervical mucus for a moment. In general, broadly, we have 2 types of mucus, whether it's long and elastic and transparent, similar to the white of an egg before cooking, all right? Is runny, elastic, clear, moist, and the woman with the middle finger and the thumb can detect the quality of the mucus, all right? Stretchy, up to an inch maybe, and not break. That is during the fertile time. Because this is down to the molecular level, actually, there are mostly proteins, but also mucopolysaccharides and other chemicals here, but mostly there are fibers or polymers that are long fibers. When the pH is right for during ovulation, these fibers are very long. They're macromolecules with hundreds of thousands of millions of atoms, and they literally form a highway for the sperm to travel through, okay? At the microscopic level, they're long fibers that channel and help the sperm wiggle up through the reproductive tract all the way out to the ampulla. When the woman is not ovulating, that same mucus changes its quality at the biochemical level, and it can be detected so that it becomes tacky, not elastic, and opaque are the 3 main characteristics, okay? And what happens is that, again, because of the change in pH in part, these long fibers, these long polymers, now start winding up on each other, and they become like a mesh. So instead of being long highways, now they become roadblocks. And it's a very effective spermicide, if you will, or block of sperm or anything else. And that's really what forms the plug also, the mucus plug here, because it's preventing, if the woman is not ovulating, there's no reason why anything should be getting in there, whether it's bacteria, virus, or semen, or sperm, or anything else. And so the body naturally forms a plug there, which is a natural contraceptive, if you will. It's preventing the sperm from going through. Very, very effective. Right?
So that's interesting. So a woman can only get a bacterial infection during ovulation?
No.
That's what you said.
She's more she's more prone to get an infection during ovulation, okay? But there are other things, so it's not that simple actually. The cervical mucus has many qualities. One of the qualities is lubrication, even for the sexual act. Another quality is nutrition for the sperm, whereas sperm only lasts about 24 hours in a man's body. In the woman's reproductive tract, the sperm can last up to 5 days because it gets nourishment from the cervical mucus. But the mucus is also a bactericide and a fungicide, okay? So it has many, many qualities to it. This plug, I understand that is mostly due to a change in pH. In other words, the actual 3-dimensional configuration of the polymers, whether they're long and elastic or they coil upon themselves and form the actual plug, okay? Plus, keep in mind, I mean, bacteria infect cells, right? And cells are microscopic. So bacteria are several orders of magnitude smaller than sperm. And therefore, whereby a sperm may not get through, bacteria may get through.
I just know that like when I've had bladder infections, the first thing they ask is, are you sexually active? I mean, that's one thing.
Yeah, because it's supposed, so the perineum, the three openings are very close to each other in the perineum, and therefore there could be an infection either from the anus to the vagina, or from the vagina to the opening of the urethra, you know. And so that's just the anatomy of the female, okay? All right, so mucus, cervical mucus is the most reliable of the three symptoms. Again, it takes some practice and several cycles for the woman to become familiar, but this by far is the most accurate of the three primary symptoms of ovulation, whether she's ovulating or not, okay? And again, it requires that self-analysis and so forth. Moving on to the 7 secondary symptoms. They're secondary because they are like byproducts of the ovulation, okay? Mittelschmerz, spotting, swollen vagina or vulva, increased libido, breast tenderness, general bloating, and firming. Okay, so let's go through them just briefly here. They're not as reliable, so these serve to either confirm the primary symptoms, but if there's a conflict between the primary and the secondary symptoms, obviously we discard the secondary symptoms, right? Okay, so Mittelschmerz comes from the Germans. It just means middle pain. So Mittel is middle and Schmerz is pain in German. And that's because the Germans discovered this, and this is the issue. When ovulation is happening, remember how I said that the fimbri, the infundibulum, which is the hand-like structure at the distal end of the fallopian tube next to the ovary, is not really attached to the ovary. It's not a single structure there, but there are two distinct structures. So the point that there is actually a gap that could be several millimeters between the ovary and the end of the fallopian tube, which is called the infundibulum, okay? So it's like a little hand-like structure, like a glove, that is hovering over the ovary. When the ovary is ovulating or the follicle is rupturing, that infundibulum will move close to the ovary, literally to catch that egg. And that movement, even if it's just a few millimeters inside the abdomen of the mother, of the woman, causes pain, causes some pain, all right? But it's not the ovulation pain, it's not the menstrual pain because it's at the opposite end, it's halfway through the cycle. It's not on the 20th day, it's on the 14th day. It's in the middle, all right? And that's why they call it Mittelschmerz. Middle because it's the middle of the cycle, and also it's in the middle of the abdominal region, anatomically where the structures are located. So that little movement of this hand causes some pain inside. Obviously, one can intuit that that pain is very subjective. Some women have a lot of pain, some women have no pain, and most women are somewhere in between, okay? It can vary with age, it can vary with diet, it can vary many things, who knows, temperature, lifestyle, activity, but it's a symptom. And it's just related to the movement of that hand that happens during ovulation. Spotting, which again is different from the spotting of the menstrual cycle, which is a much larger flow on average, right? This is associated typically with the actual rupturing of the follicle, okay? Again, all of these symptoms are very subjective. And so we have a full range from some women, a few women that feel strong in all these, to a few women that essentially don't have any of these symptoms or very, very slight and are not able to detect them every cycle. And most women will be somewhere in between because these are ranges. These are quantitative traits. They follow more or less a bell-shaped curve, right? Also, what happens is that the woman is retaining fluids in general, retaining water and other fluids in her body. And some of that fluid will accumulate around the opening of the vagina, also in preparation for a possible intercourse. So it's all associated with the marital act. The libido also, so it's not just at the physiological level. Again, nature is telling us, is pointing toward a unitary vision of the human person, meaning the psychological also. In psychological terms, sexual arousal, called libido in psychological terms, is increased naturally during ovulation because there's more estrogen that hits the pressure sensors of the brain and so forth and so on. So that is consistent with what is happening physiologically, okay? Can be a challenge because on average, if she feels more desirous when she's ovulating, but they're trying to avoid children, then it's more challenging, right? But that's the reality. Breast tenderness, again, in preparation for a possible lactation 9 months later. We know all this hormonal cycle that the breasts do swell during that process. But especially the nipple tends to become more tender. So it's another secondary symptom with a broad range of expression. General bloating, again, has to do with retaining water, the hormonal cycle thing. Finally, ferning, which I don't know if I have I didn't have a photo here. Ferning is interesting because it's a little magnifying glass. It turns out that the estrogen, the extra estrogen, is not only on the brain and the ovaries and all the reproductive tract and so forth, but the excess estrogen or the higher amount of estrogen is for her whole body, even to the level of the saliva. So a woman ovulating on average has a little more estrogen in her saliva. And so estrogen, being a protein, an organic compound, will crystallize when it dries and will form this pattern that is a fern-like pattern, all right? From fern, as in fern. Oh, fern, the plant. These guys, okay? So you're familiar with ferns, and they have this pattern with the stalk and the leaflets. That same general pattern happens in this event of ferning. You can see it here. This is a very clear one. They're not all that clear, but what happens is one takes a little amount of, the woman would take some saliva and put it on a glass slide that is very clean and allow the saliva to dry naturally, all right? And the hope is that if there is excess estrogen, it will start crystallizing in this kind of pattern. If there is no estrogen, you will not have that distinct pattern. Like for instance, this doesn't have a distinct crystallization pattern, all right? And now there is a kit that can be bought, which is like a little tube, like a little handheld microscope or lens. You will see your ferning kit that can be bought. There you have it. All right. There's a little tube. It's like a little magnifying glass, and it comes with the slides and everything else, but it's not that reliable for $30. Okay. So anyway, just for the sake of completion, it's one of the 7 known symptoms that are secondary to ovulation, and it's there. But again, when there's a contradiction, this helps to confirm the primary symptoms, but when they are in contradiction to the primary symptom, then we go the primary, not the secondary, okay? All right, I want to mention also that there are several protocols and methods that have already been clinically tested. And in general, they give as high reliability as contraceptive, for example, when it's used for avoiding conception, up to 97%, 99%, depending, of course, human behavior is very much involved in here. So just like with the contraception, human behavior is very much involved, but when it is used accurately and consistently and so forth with lots of discipline, it can give a high 90th percentile efficiency rate of typically avoiding conception, right? Which is what many of the couples want to do. They want to avoid a conception at a particular time in their marriage or relationship. The creator model is highly technological, And they have designed already interventions to deal with endometriosis and so forth. So NAPRO is used mostly by couples who actually want to conceive and have a difficulty conceiving. At the other end of the scale is Family of the Americas. Billings was a doctor who was the one who pioneered the whole issue about the mucus, and is based mostly on the mucus of the 3 primary symptoms, but mostly mucus. The others, simple thermal, for example, like the word says, is a combination between the mucus, the activity of the cervix, and the temperature. So this would include the 3 primary symptoms. Billings is strictly the mucus. Family of Americas is a variation on Billings. Couple-to-couple league also is a combination, but these are outfits that are there. They have websites, they have a lot of charts and products that are available for couples to chart their cycles. So I give them as references. These are 5 of the main. Family of the Americas in particular is one that I like because it was developed by this lady, Mercedes Arbesu. She is the wife of a Guatemalan ex-president, very devout family. They're in DC, or I think they're in Front Royal, I think, Virginia. But Mercedes Arbesu has actually used this method to teach Guatemalan indigenous women who are illiterate with the diagrams and the graphs and the drawings and photographs to be able to chart their cycle, all right? And so it's very intuitive and it's very respectful of the woman's cycle and so forth, and doesn't require any reading or writing, basically interpreting photographs and mucus and so forth. So that's, she has it also in Spanish and English. She has a thick manual, she has smaller ones, they have charts online that one can download and so forth, okay? So there's a lot there. For the husband, of course, all of what I said so far is theory, right? Because he's not ovulating for sure. Therefore, what are we requiring of the husband with NFP? Well, certainly a lot of discipline and generosity and lots of communication between them and so forth. At the end of the day, that is going to translate one way or another into sacrificial love, especially if they're using it to abstain, to avoid pregnancies. Because it's on average when they desire it the most that they would have to abstain, okay? So the will is definitely full-time engaged in this one, on both parts. But for it to really work, both wills have to be on board, right? So all that dialogue that needs to go on between the couple. And also this openness, and that's why this is key here. This is not insignificant. This is key to establishing how NFP may be ethical and not just another type of contraception, because one could say, well, they're using it to avoid children anyway, so it's a natural contraception instead of artificial, right? And it can be. So NFP can certainly be used with a contraceptive mentality, meaning to avoid children at all costs, by just going to do it naturally instead of artificially, all right? So that's where we get back. So this NFP is at the level of means. It offers a means that is ethical, but still the end needs to be justified. So in the case of NFP, the means are okay, but the ends need to justify. Why am I avoiding the children? Is it because I just want absolute control? I don't want to have any children, period, at all? Or is it that I have justifiable reasons for avoiding the children, you see? And so with NFP, the means are ethical in principle because they're following nature. In other words, the couple is availing themselves of a natural cycle, which on average, she's infertile about 3/4 of the time of the cycle. How do I get to the 3/4? Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Just to consolidate the issue of the means, we have to justify it at the means and at the end level, right? Both. So at the level of the means, it's justified because it doesn't introduce an artificial separation between unitive and procreative, okay? irrespective of human nature, maintains the unity, the integrity of the marital act. All right. But for the couple who is avoiding children, they're going to avail themselves of the infertile time. And so this is where humanae vitae comes back into relevance, which is this: well-grounded, justifiable, serious reasons to space their children. Okay? The couple may avail themselves of the natural cycles that are imminent in human reproduction. Okay? That's the famous paragraph 16 of Humanae Vitae. So again, the church is not saying, well, the couple has to have a child every time they have intercourse. That's not what the church is saying. In fact, this talks about responsible parenthood. The couple needs to be responsible about the number of children that they have. And it may be that at times having another child is irresponsible, or even having a first child may be irresponsible. Each couple needs to decide, but it's a very personal between the two of them. It's a very sacred, I don't know how else to put it, it's a very sacred decision that the couple needs to make when and how many children to have. Very, very sacred. Why is it sacred? Because that couple is collaborating with the creative activity of God in a very unique way, all right, of creating a new human being. And so it definitely has to be a very serious event. That's another reason why, I mean, we have to get real. Contraception and in vitro tend to abaratar, how do you say, cheapen, tend to cheapen the intimacy of the couple, okay? Because seemingly it doesn't have any consequences. Whereas it's not the design of God who gave us our nature as we are. The act of that intimacy is so special and intimate and so forth, and there's so much at stake in that intimacy that it needs to be respected to its fullest content, all right? And so that's why with NFP, the couple who's going to use NFP, necessarily they have to talk about it. They have to be in agreement, you know, and he has to be very supportive of her because, again, let's say the burden is on her. Yes, the burden is on her to determine her time of ovulation, but the burden is on him to hold his horses and truly dialogue when and if she consents. Mm-hmm. And so really, at the end of the day, existentially, the burden is really on both. It's more, it levels the playing field a little bit more, all right? So that's why at the end, we can justify it for serious reasons. And really that's with regards to natural family planning. Now, so we see it doesn't involve with NFP, the couple needs to be aware that they're not going to have absolute control, even though they may have up to 95 or 97%, whatever the statistics are giving of efficiency, like or effectiveness, like the pill, for example, or contraceptive. The mentality is different because the desire is not to have an absolute control of procreation, but a reasonable control of procreation. And what do I mean by that? Let's say that a couple has found sufficient reasons to avoid conception at a particular time in their marriage. For whatever important serious reason, it could be financial, could be health-wise, could be relocation, you name it, studies, etc. We have justifiable reason for avoiding children at this time in our marriage, okay? So we're gonna go NFP. What if, after the best of their ability, and she is so certain about her ovulation time, and yes, honey, I'm ovulating right now, so stay away, etc. You know, they stay away and they have intercourse when she's, in their mind, she's not ovulating. And she does get pregnant. what is that couple going to do with that pregnancy? Is she going to abort the child or not? Well, the NFP couple would not abort the child because they're not looking for absolute control of the procreation. They're looking for reasonable control. If after their best ability and they try to avoid pregnancy, they still get pregnant, typically the generosity will lead them to accept that pregnancy and move forward. Okay? And so it's a reasonable control, but it's not desiring an absolute control. And that's where we can justify it as an end because they have serious reason for avoiding the children. But if they do happen to get pregnant, then they're going to accept that pregnancy. And typically all of these NFP programs, they mention that to the couple so that they know they're forewarned because no method is 100% except abstention, then that small percentage needs to be factored in. You know? Right?
Will be the moral equivalence between that mental, say,
the mindset or
like,
mental.
kind of see kind of the mindset is let's try to prevent, try to avoid
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And the mindset of using a physical barrier like a condom or a diaphragm that doesn't preclude 100%
Right.
the consummation. It's just a physical barrier, but errors may happen. I mean, there's still a great level of intimacy in the couple. I mean, how do we make that equivalency, or how?
Well, that's the contraceptive mentality. Exactly, that's precisely. It's at the level of the desire, no? In a contraceptive mentality, my desire is to avoid conception, absolutely. Whereas with NFP, I understand that there is always a risk that she will be pregnant, okay, that she will get pregnant. But in the contraceptive mentality, there is the desire, otherwise why contracept? You know, why just leave it up to chance? If I'm contracepting, it's because I truly, fully want to avoid that conception by any means possible, including the sterilization and whatnot, you know. So it is a different mindset. It's truly a different mindset that is a radical difference between the two. And it's at the level of the intentionality. There's no way around it precisely because of free will. Look, if God allows us to crucify his own son, you know, he certainly is respectful of our will, even if it goes against us and everybody else, our own will. Okay, but he's respectful. He doesn't impose his will on us. And so we have choice. We have true choice, true real choice. Mm-hmm. Also, there are many other factors. It's getting a little late, but there are many other factors involved here that are healthy and beneficial for the couple, even if it's just at the natural level. There are no side effects involved with chemical contraceptives, or there's no awkwardness of the mechanical contraceptives involved in the sexual intimacy. There's a natural flow. It certainly increases the level of communication and generosity between the couple exponentially because they have to talk about it, all right, and they have to be generous with each other. I want to go back to that window of 3/4 of the time of infertility, because how do we make that calculation? Again, it's kind of a global calculation, okay, but we can go by the year, by the days, assuming that the cycle is truly a lunar cycle, which is of 28 days, the fertility, the ovulation cycle. Then we're talking about 4 weeks of 7 days each. And we know that the egg, on average, is only fertile, mature for 24 hours, about 24 hours. And after that, it starts becoming over-ripened and is discarded, which becomes eventually the menstrual cycle, menstruation. But in that 24 hours, the sperm, I mentioned, can last up to 5 days in the female reproductive tract. And therefore, that window of opportunity is expanded automatically to 5 days. In other words, the couple may have had intercourse up to 5 days prior to ovulation, and she may still get pregnant. Okay? I think that the shortest time, I've heard just anecdotally, because how do you measure that? It maybe is 5 to 10 minutes from ejaculation to fertilization, you know. But on the outside is up to 5 days approximately, all right? So that's the window of fertility. But then they also talk about leaving an extra day before and after, just for precaution. It makes it easy on the math, so that if that couple leaves an extra day before and after those 5 days, then that makes it 7, which is 1 week out of the 4 weeks. And that's why we can say that on average, a woman using, or a couple using NFP, by abstaining 1/4 of the time during her cycle, they can avoid children essentially throughout their marriage. You know, they would concentrate their sexual intimacy during the other 3/4, the other 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. But again, that's an average. It's forever that challenge of going from a statistical model to a probabilistic model of this particular couple. So there's no substitute for her becoming familiar with her symptoms, you know, to the best of her ability, and for him to be very respectful of that cycle. Okay, that's what I have. So we've covered abortion, contraception, in vitro fertilization, NFP. From here, we're going to move to other bioethical issues that happen at the beginning of human life, like in vitro stem cell research. And I'll end, hopefully, with a positive note on fetal surgery and just medical interventions on the unborn that have been successful.
But what about adoption? Are you gonna cover?
Well, adoption as such.
The social issue.
Yeah, it is. Let me bring it in because I'm running out of time here. Let me bring it in at the end when we talk about fetal surgery and other, there's a procedure called 3-parent embryos and so forth. I'll talk about that then, okay? And the ethics about adoption. Okay, again, yeah. Mm-hmm. This one from Manevite, previous? As a means, this one, yeah, okay.
When you were talking about the 3 primary symptoms,
yep,
cervix activity,
right.
can you just tell me what that is again, because I don't have anything written down here.
Yeah.
That one's like off-center?
This one. There are several. There are 3 activities of the cervix. When the woman is not ovulating, the cervix is further down. It drops. That's the word. It drops. It is firm. It's like a little cone. All right. It's firm, tight, and kind of off-center. Even, I mean, anatomically, thank you to God, we're talking about adults here, and I know that many of you are married. Even the off-centeredness is to try to anatomically avoid the head of the penis and the exit of the semen. Mm-hmm. So they don't match. Whereas when she is ovulating, that cervix literally becomes the complement of the head of the penis. All right, to try to make as smooth a passage as possible anatomically from the penis into the uterus. Hmm? So it's very interesting how the anatomy all matches up and everything works well. All right, sure. Okay, thank you again for enduring all this. I know it's a lot of information, but that's why I try to do the biology of it so that we can then do the ethical analysis based on it.
So what is the provision of the church regarding the soul of those embryos there?
Like the frozen human embryos? Yes, thank you. That's why I made the whole point of emphasizing that they are alive, but in suspended animation. Literally, suspended animation, if we break out the words, means that the body and the soul is frozen, but it's there. Because if the soul leaves the body, we have death. And that embryo will not come back to life until the second coming, okay? But so embryos, frozen embryos do die, and when they die, their soul is released. This also has to do with something that I mentioned with the embryo, remember fetal reabsorption or embryo reabsorption or resorption, how to maintain a consistent theology of ensoulment, of immediate ensoulment. If one possibility would be to consider that when that other embryo is reabsorbed, that embryo dies, so that that soul goes to the mercy of God. And that means that as long as there is no minimum time necessary to exist in order to have a soul, all right? It could be just a few minutes, or it could be 104 years like Kirk Douglas, right? So as long as we don't put a time limit on God for granting a soul and death, then the argument is consistent. Applied also here. The argument is consistent for in vitro also and for cryopreservation.
So even though those things are created, mechanically.
Yes.
Okay.
What do I say? I say that God has been forced into granting a soul to that in vitro baby, because again, there are certain things that God cannot be. Obviously, there are limits. We're talking reasonable here. We're talking logic. And this logic, this reasoning that we're doing necessarily has to exist on a substratum that we call the brain, which is an organic. So our mind, our thought process necessarily has to occur on an organic process based on life as we know it here, which is carbon-based, okay? And so yes, there are organic limits to our thinking. But once we are thinking, it's reasonable. In other words, we're capable of understanding each other, we're capable of conveying ideas. So what I'm trying to say is that, I lost the track. Oh yes, I'm saying that in vitro, God is forced to grant a soul to that in vitro baby, very similar to the case of pregnancy resulting from a sexual assault, from rape. The child of rape is still the child of God. And so is the woman who got raped, all right? And so God is not going to deny, because there's nothing more cruel for God to deny a soul to a human being. Literally, that human being will be soulless, which means that that human being is incapable of redemption. The blood of Christ is useless for a soulless human being.
So you meaning that God will have to violate a divine law?
Not at all.
Would have to if he denies the soul.
Oh yes, yeah.
Body.
That's why I'm saying God cannot contradict himself, or at least
the soul,
yeah.
Body, also are human beings.
Right.
Not granting the soul would be a violation of
yeah.
a divine law.
Right. In other words, if I'm saying that in vitro is intrinsically evil, why should God be forced into granting a soul to that human being? And that's part of the injustice. In fact, to me, that is the gravest injustice, is that we're literally forcing the hand of God, okay? Because God will not leave that human being who now is a victim of that procedure, will not leave him soulless. Because then, if he did, then the blood of Christ would be useless for that human being. No possibility of redeeming a soulless human being, right? And so, obviously, the limits of this reasoning is reason, is human reason. And I understand that, but we can only reason humanly, okay?
And another limit would be the concept of time. We always think in time increments.
Oh, yes.
And we
yes.
we apply some value to adding time. So, what naturally we tend to say, it's a very human thing to do, that the older the process, the more validation or value it has. So that kind of throws off understanding the logical consistency, that it doesn't matter if it's 1 second or 100 years. Is something that happens instantaneously. It is an essence.
Look, if we fail to see the human zygote as human or as fully human, these arguments don't matter. If we fail to see the human zygote as fully human, no argument will suffice, because it's all predicated on the humanity of the human zygote. That's all. And that's why I say that humanity does not accept gradation, because if it does, then who decides? Who is more human and who is less human? The state or an individual or a committee or the lab that has more money? Who decides? It is subjective. These are philosophical and theological arguments, but we're capable of these arguments. We're really capable of these arguments, okay? Some may see it, some may not see it, some may eventually see it. I can tell you, when I was in my 20s, I didn't see it. Okay? But at some point, God gave me the grace to see it. And that's why I devoted the rest of my life to try to help others see it too. Because literally, it means the difference between life and death for some humans who are in a precarious state of dependence. So, thanks again. And now, for the next 2 weeks, you will be spared of my presence. I have to be, next Saturday I'm out of town, and the following Saturday we have prison ministry all Saturday. So the next time we'll meet will be February 29, okay? And we'll have 2 more weeks, February 9 and March 7 for beginning of life. And then on March 14, we'll go into end of life issues, all right? So, all right, thanks again, and I'll send you all this and see you hopefully in 3 weeks.
You know the date that the summer class starts?
Not offhand, Maggie, but it would be, yeah,
Curious.
it would be right after,
2 classes are 8 weeks.
yes. Yeah, it's summer one. But anyway, you can get into the site of St. Thomas and look at the summer schedule, okay? The summer calendar. Let me shut this down so that I can start the downloading. So here, yes.
This class was
Okay,
so fast.
let me, I know. Okay, stop recording. Thanks again, and bye-bye.